we're rounding the corner. This is the 7th presentation. So we're on the last half of the semester. You're taking midterms, I'm sure, and I are aware of that as well. But thanks for being here today. This is Group A, so it's your second time attending. And we always look like a very small group in this big auditorium. But I want to let our presenters know that for every student who's here, there's 5 watching online right now, and so we welcome those of you who are watching online. This is a presentation that we've done for a couple years now. Once a semester, I invite some faculty members to be our presenters, rather than bringing in speakers from out of town. And part of the reason for this is that we really value the general education experience that we offer students here. And one of the great things about general education is that all of your classes can connect and inform one another. And if you're taking a foundations class, you will be studying that in that class. But what today is we'll have a similar experience. We're going to be thinking about COVID, which I know that we think about probably all day, every day. But I've invited 3 scholars to talk about how their disciplines are approaching the issue of COVID and the pandemic. And I'll introduce them in just a minute. I do want to just say, for those of you taking the class, keep in mind that you have cultural events to attend. You need to go to an art science event, a theater dance event, and a music culture event. And there's a high profile free event for music tonight and tomorrow night. If you look out on the practice field by the football stadium, you'll see a stage set up, and you can go to a concert tonight. It will be especially rap and hip hop, and tomorrow night will be more of it'll be protest songs. And one of the music professors said that if you're mad about something, there'll be a song for you tomorrow night. But if you go and after you experience the concert, go online and find the music culture post-event survey and fill that out. I'll give you credit for attending a cultural event. I'll also let you know in the next couple days, I'll send everyone an email. Because of COVID, we don't have as many events this semester, and I'm going to supplement live events with some online options. And so I will send those out to you very soon, and you can complete some cultural events using video that's been taken of past live events. Finally, if there's anyone here in the auditorium who still needs to meet me, come up afterwards. I'd love to just meet you, make sure you don't have any questions, and help in any way I can. I did want to just begin. We've got a title slide here, and we've got 3 presenters that I'll introduce, but I think any faculty member on campus could come and present on this topic. And I was just going to mention, as a way to expand the conversation, my training is as a folklorist. I teach English, and I've been really surprised with the folk response to COVID, and the ways in which people have talked about it and understood its significance. And I just wanted to show one example to kind of get you thinking. So you probably know this image. From World War II, the raising of the flag over Iwo Jima. Iconic American image. And you probably have seen this flag, or this image as well. That Americans after 9/11 understood, made sense of the significance of that event by making it as epic and as heroic, the firefighters' responses to 9/11 as Iwo Jima. And so this image was meant to be kind of a way to evoke the Iwo Jima image. Well, right after COVID hit, I saw this image and made some connections. That political cartoon where scientists, doctors, nurses, and first responders are depicted in that same pose with the flag. And this highlights the fact that I think as humans, our responses to COVID have been as dramatic and important and complicated as Americans' responses to 9/11 or World War II. And so if I had more time, I could talk more about how folklore relates, and I'd love to have a biologist come and talk about how COVID relates to biology, and a political scientist, and on and on and on and on. But for today, I'm really pleased for who we are going to hear from. Let me introduce them, and then we'll get started. Our first presenter is Professor Jonathan Bodrero. He grew up in Tooele, Utah, and he earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics with a numerical analysis specialization and minors in chemistry and physics. Later, he did a master's degree in mathematics and math education at BYU, and he's taught full-time at Snow College for 20 years. He's also served as chair of the math department during that time. He does a lot of work in the state on statewide committees that work to improve math education in Utah and at Snow. And he's married to Dr. Cheryl James Bodrero, who teaches French and Italian here at Snow. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers, and then they'll just come up one at a time. Our second presenter is going to be Professor Kristi Stevens. She divided her childhood between small-town Utah and the Italian-American New England coast, which sounds amazing. These experiences shaped her belief that no matter our cultural differences, all humans have basic needs for connection and belonging. She attended Snow College and graduated from Utah State with a bachelor's degree in family and human development, and she earned a master's in arts in professional communication from Southern Utah University. She and her husband Jason are the parents of 2 daughters, 1 son, 1 son-in-law, and 1 granddaughter who was born the week of the quarantine that started with COVID, so that's a claim to fame for her granddaughter. Finally, Professor Anthony P. Smith teaches composition, research writing, and philosophy, world religions at Snow, and he's currently finishing his dissertation from the University of Utah. And I don't know if you're doing this, but when I was finishing my dissertation, I would just walk around mumbling ideas for my dissertation. And he has degrees from Luther College in Iowa and from the University of Colorado. And within philosophy, he's primarily interested in ethics, decision theory, and philosophy of science. Put another way, as both a teacher and a scholar, Tony is worried about the big problems we face as human beings, and his goal is to find better ways to think, write, and talk about these issues. And so will you join me in welcoming all 3 of our presenters, but Jonathan to the podium.
Thank you, Dr. Allred. Get connected here, and we'll get going. Hang on one second. We had it set up, but it just reset. Okay, now we're good. All right, so thank you for the introduction. Today, I'm going to talk about how mathematics, my discipline, my field, makes sense of the world, including the coronavirus. Being a math teacher, and since this is Snow College, I'm going to make this presentation educational and even interactive. So in about 5 minutes, I'll actually have you pull out your electronic device and participate in a poll. Okay? So fundamentally, mathematics is the study of patterns. These patterns can be artistic, such as fractals, including the Mandelbrot set, or they may be algebraic, such as equations modeling electricity and magnetism. Now, these number patterns are all over, and they start very basic. So even our young children in elementary school, they start learning the counting pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, and on. And as they grow up and develop, and as we grow up and develop, so do our patterns and practices, and we're better able to understand the world around us. Okay? To do so, we often have to count or measure things repeatedly as we look for these patterns. Now, when I was asked to talk about mathematics and coronavirus, the first thing that jumped to my mind was COVID counters. So those are the timely tallies of coronavirus cases each day. And I found several online. Now, Professor Stevens might talk about this, but make sure that you look for good sources. Not everything that you see online can be believed. So look for reputable sources. Some of these might include the Johns Hopkins University of Medicine, worldometers.info. They even give you their sources for their data, or even coronavirus.utah.gov. So this graph right here shows the daily case count of coronavirus. And I took this last week when I was finishing my slide deck for this presentation. So you can see that on October 14th, we had almost 1,500 cases in Utah. So how does mathematics understand this rate of growth of the coronavirus in Utah and around the world? Well, there are many growth models. I'm going to talk about three. The first is going to be linear growth, and that is characterized by a fixed increase per time period. Exponential growth is a percentage increase, and logistic growth is a little bit more sophisticated. We'll see him in about 2 minutes. So anyone that has had a part-time job and been paid by the hour understands linear growth. So if you have a job and you're paid $10 an hour, if you work 1 hour, you earn $10. You work an extra hour, you get an extra $10. You work a third hour, you get an extra $10. So the growth rate is constant, and it gives us this characteristic linear shape. So how does that linear growth model map onto the coronavirus cases in Utah? So taking data from the 1st of April through the end of September, so a 6-month period, in orange I have the actual coronavirus cases reported, and then in blue I have a linear regression model, so linear growth model, to describe the data. You can see that it's a moderate fit. It's not perfect. There are many factors in the number of cases. And right now, as of September, this 1,000 cases per week is actually a severe underestimate. So one way to correct for that is to use a different model. We could use exponential growth. Exponential growth occurs in many areas, and one of my favorites is finance. I'm betting my retirement on exponential growth. So when I invest money, say $10,000 at 6% interest, the first year it gets a little bit of interest, namely $600. But then that $600 plus the $10,000 earns more and more and more interest, and we get the characteristic increase of growth. So the growth rate gets bigger and bigger and bigger based on the percentage of what was there. So how does the exponential growth map onto our coronavirus cases? Well, again, you can see in orange the actual coronavirus cases, and in red the exponential growth model. This one, for those who are interested, that's a 16% growth rate per week. You can see that it was a little bit low during the summer, and it's a little bit high towards the end of September. But that's a regression model, okay? So a best fit model. The third growth model I wanted to talk about is logistic growth. And this can be best understood through an example, such as bacteria in a petri dish. So if we put in our biology class some bacteria in a petri dish and let them grow, they start off with exponential-like growth, but at around, in this case, about 28 hours, you can see that the growth rate starts to decrease. This is because the bacteria have to start to compete for food and resources. And that growth rate continues to slow down until it plateaus towards something we call a ceiling or carrying capacity. So how does the logistic growth model map onto our actual coronavirus cases? Well, again, in orange, the actual cases. And we did have a brief slowdown in the growth rate in August, but it's ticked up again, so the logistic model is still in the exponential growth form right here. We haven't quite hit that magic inflection point where things are starting to go down. Okay. Now, these are just models. They're possible ways that things could happen. They are not absolute predictions about what will happen. In fact, we'll see here in just a second that they give us different results, so at least one of them has to be incorrect. So if we were to take these models and project them out through Christmas time, towards the end of the year, the linear growth model, based on the first 6 months, would predict that we would have about 80,000 cases in Utah at that time. Exponential growth would predict that we would have over 500,000, over 500,000 cases by Christmas time. And logistic growth is going to predict about 400,000, 425,000. So a little bit more conservative than exponential, but certainly a lot more than the linear growth. So here's where it gets interactive. So please take out your electronic device. Those of you online, feel free to join us as well. So which of these three growth models if we can get this. So go to, whoa, why won't you, hang on one second. I promise it worked earlier. All right, so which of the growth models do you think will be the most accurate? So please go to menti.com and enter the code 5117382. And I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. (51, 17, 38, 2). And that's at menti.com. Give you about 10 more seconds. All right. Looks like the most popular was the logistic model. That's what I think will happen, or that's my prediction for the most accurate. And let me take a second and get there. So if we take a look at these growth models and we were to project them not just through the end of the year, but through the end of March of next year, the linear model is predicting a very small number. The exponential model is going to predict about 4.5 million cases, and the logistic model is going to predict a little over 1.5 million cases. Noticing that the population of Utah is about 3.2 million cases, the exponential model can't hold forever. Now, I've got something set up so you can model now. All right, so I do have a sense of humor. But what I mean is you can model with the data. So I've set up a page on the desmos.com site where you can go in, and in orange I've got the actual data, and the blue linear growth model, the red exponential, and the purple logistic model, and you can go in and actually adjust those and see what you think of the growth rates and see if you can make a better fit. Now, a second real-world application for mathematics is money. People are wondering what the financial cost of the coronavirus will be. One of those aspects is the cost of a COVID hospitalization. This is important because about 5% of all COVID cases in Utah result in hospitalization, and about 1 in 160 result in death. Now, what is a typical cost for a COVID hospitalization? Let's go back to our Menti and go to the next question. And let's see, what do you think is the median cost of a COVID hospitalization? Is it 5,000, 100,000, 200,000, or sorry, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, or over 60,000? What do you think would be the median or typical cost for a trip to the hospital? Thank you. So, looks like so far 20,000 is the winner. Actually, the correct answer is 40,000. Whoops. And let's go back to our slideshow. I'll even show you that. Okay. So, data from Fair Health published in July shows that the median cost by age is roughly $40,000, and that's the purple bars. The green bar shows what the insurance company typically will pay, meaning the patient may be responsible for the remaining $15,000 to $20,000. Now, there have been some other high-profile cases, such as the $1.1 million COVID bill in Seattle, or the $1.9 million COVID bill for a New York man who's just a little bit older than me. And I could go on about the other uses of mathematics to understand COVID, such as the effectiveness of vaccines, the effectiveness of face masks in preventing transmission of the virus, or even a study that was published towards the end of the summer showing that wearing a face mask can actually improve your physical appearance. But I would like to leave you with this question. How will you use math to understand the world around you, including the coronavirus? And to get you thinking, I'm going to show you two slides of demographics of Utah COVID cases. The first is broken down by age. And the second is by ethnicity. Those of you participating via YouTube, please feel free to put in your thoughts, your questions in the chat or in the comments. Finally, to conclude, I thank you for taking COVID precautions. Please continue to wear your mask, as it will prevent infections and having to quarantine, save you money on hospital bills, and may even improve your physical appearance. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here. Let me get my slide presentation up and running, and we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like it doesn't want to play here. Let's try this one. Okay. Last April, as I was wrapping up a video conferencing version of what used to be a face-to-face class, I had a few students ask me if I would let the meeting go on a little bit longer. These students, who used to be on campus, were now in quarantine, and they asked me if I'd let this class and the regularly scheduled class time roll over so that they could talk to each other just a little bit longer. Well, it was my last class of the day, so I agreed. And for the next hour, I listened as these students expressed how much they missed each other since the quarantine began. Locked behind screens and socially isolated, they shared how much they missed each other face to face since COVID had changed the daily face of life around the globe. As a professor of communication, I've witnessed this pandemic. I've wondered, what exactly are the impacts of social distancing on communication? Now, communication is essential to our well-being, and COVID-19 has altered the way in which we interact. These alterations have led individuals to seek out communication needs in new ways, and these new ways may have important implications on both individuals and society. So I want you guys to think for a minute, how much does communication mean to you? Now, we use communication to make sense of our daily worlds. We use it to basically develop an understanding of who and what we are. We use it to meet our physical, emotional, and social needs. In fact, we use communication to essentially understand our identities and survive in the world. And humans don't just require any type of communication to survive. What we really need are called communication-rich environments. Now, these communication-rich environments are in-person communication experiences that involve a large portion of nonverbal communication. Now, when we look at communication, 90% of what you communicate is actually through your nonverbal skills. Of that 90% of nonverbal communication, 60% involves things like body language, hand gestures, facial expressions, physical touch, and eye contact. The other 30% involves something we call paralanguage. Now, paralanguage is essentially the emphasis and expression that we place on our words. Now, without these forms of communication, our interactions can feel pretty lean. Lundstedt, Smith, and Layton reported in their meta-analytic review of 150 studies on social relationships and mortality rates that humans that are socially connected are more likely to live on average 4 years longer than socially isolated individuals. And the Journal for the American Medical Association identifies over 50 years of research linking social relationships or the lack of social relationships as dangerous to individual health as cigarette smoking. So when we interact with others, our bodies are flooded with feel-good neurochemicals like dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. In fact, even the act of smiling can increase your mood. Paula Neanderthal, lead psychologist at the University of Wisconsin's Emotion Lab, states that there's good evidence that smiling has the same effect on your has some important effect on your ambient emotional state. So when we communicate, we gain confidence and connection and feelings of belonging. And humans require this communication-rich environment in order to thrive. And suddenly, due to COVID-19, all of those areas are gone. Due to COVID-19, we were removed from effective forms of human interaction, and we needed to stay within the boundaries of our homes. Most of the methods that we use to meet our needs, such as attending events or classes or places of worship or getting together at parties or concerts, were suddenly gone. And even shooting small talk at the grocery store with a person that you meet was suddenly looked upon and frowned upon. And on the rare occasion when we did go out socially, we were asked to socially distance and wear masks that cover roughly 2/3 of our faces. So socialization and face-to-face communication were discouraged. And I asked my students in class, I asked all of my courses this semester, if during the quarantine they felt isolated and alone. And I was amazed at the results. These students expressed that not only did they feel isolation and loneliness during the quarantine, that they still felt that way. They expressed that college just doesn't feel quite the same as it did in the past. Without school activities or events, a lot of students express that they're having a hard time getting to know people and make friends. They express some disappointment about their college experiences. And they express that even if they do hang out, they're not sure if it's okay, and they expressed feelings of guilt. And they're not alone. Dr. Tim Levine, chair of the College of Arts and Sciences Department of Communication Studies at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, discovered that when people are isolated, they tend to grow suspicious of others. The less contact we have with people, the more we become suspicious of those people. And this makes others defensive, which leads to a vicious spiral. Isolation leads to suspicion, which leads to defensiveness, which leads to further suspicion, and you can see the pattern from there, which leads to further isolation. To make matters even worse, and all of these matters are made worse when you can't see facial expressions. Now, we essentially have 3 different types of smiles. We have smiles to express pleasure, smiles to express friendliness, and smiles to express dominance. But when we are required to wear masks that cover up 2/3 of our faces, we have a much more difficult time trying to interpret what those smiles mean. And without those social cues from engaging in those types of interaction, we are really having a hard time understanding the messages people are trying to send to us. And what happens when friends can no longer hug or touch or hold hands? Dr. Keltner, a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, states that a lack of physical touch can affect people in more ways than they realize. Touch is the fundamental source of connection. Touch deprivation can impact people both psychologically and physically. And once humans socially isolate, they start to create these feelings of paranoia, depression, and anxiety, which in some people can lead to aggression. So when our social needs aren't met and socializing becomes more challenging, it also becomes much harder for us to empathize with others. So social isolation can have a profound impact on how we behave, and we find ourselves starving for human interaction, which leads us to seek out communication in new ways. I mean, if we can't see each other face to face, at least we can interact with a screen, right? But the internet, unfortunately, is a sorry substitute for human interaction. Unlike face-to-face interactions that require us to adjust and adapt to the people around us, the internet is tailor-made to our own individual tastes and preferences. So each time you log on to TikTok or Instagram or search out the latest streaming choices on Disney+, you're not seeing what others see. You are seeing results that are tailor-made just for you. And so it doesn't matter if you're cyber-stalking a crush or viewing epic fails on YouTube, these supercomputers are gathering data based on your previous online experience to predict what you would like to view next and to keep you viewing. These algorithms have become so well adapted to our own individual tastes and interests that when we engage in online communication, we can become trapped in an echo chamber that shouts our own ideas and beliefs back at us. And it doesn't take long, if you're only seeing ideas and information that interest you, to believe that everyone sees, thinks, and feels exactly as you do. And when we do come across others who don't share our beliefs, that echo chamber leads us to believe that others are misinformed, uneducated, and just plain wrong. Our anger, distrust, and lack of empathy grows. And because people engage in the internet largely when they're alone, they can't read the normal social cues that help regulate and restrict our behaviors in face-to-face communication. So if you put all these pieces together, you can see how the offline world currently can feel like a powder keg about to explode. So what do? What's the solution? How do we stay sane in this crazy world? It is necessary that we continue to socially distance and wear masks and quarantine when COVID-19 rates grow too high. But it's also important for us to maintain our sanity and humanity. So I want to encourage you, whether you're reaching out face-to-face or online, to seek real connections. Step away from the internet a few hours a day and pay attention to the people around you. Look around the room. Do you know these people? It's possible that some of you out there may actually be feeling isolated and alone, but you're not alone. I guess that the person at your left and the person at your right feel the same way that you do. So when you leave today, I want to encourage you to make eye contact with the other people out there in the audience and smile. And when you smile, because you're behind a mask, I want you to smile big enough so we can see it reach your eyes. Communication is essential to our well-being, and COVID-19 has altered the way we interact. These interactions have led to individuals to meet communication needs in new and unique ways that may have implications on individuals and societies. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is the new normal for now, but it won't always be normal. So in the meantime, I don't want you to forget when you leave today that when you interact with others, there are other people behind those masks just like you. And though we may not feel like it right now, we really are all in this together.
All right, thank you. COVID is, to a vast extent, a problem about risk because many aspects of the disease are shrouded in uncertainty. Whether an individual you encounter has COVID is uncertain given that individuals can be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic for days or weeks at a time. Whether you'll get COVID, even if you're exposed, is uncertain given the potential conditions for transmission. Whether you'll develop symptoms, how severe these symptoms are, and whether they will be fatal is uncertain given the variety of courses that the disease can take within different people, particularly of different ages. Managing COVID, then, is a matter of managing risk. Philosophers, utilizing insights from economics, medicine, psychology, mathematics, environmental studies, and political science, have taken a wide variety of perspectives on how to understand and deal with risky choices. Given the short time that I have here, I want to discuss two types of problems surrounding risk that philosophers have been interested in: precautionary reasoning and lockdowns, as well as concerns about medical testing. In March of this year, Ferguson et al. Published what is now the famous, or infamous, depending on who you are, Imperial Report. The report attempted to model the spread of COVID throughout the United States and the United Kingdom. The upshot of this report was that radical measures were needed to combat the spread of COVID so that the rate of critical cases would not overwhelm our hospitals and our ability to treat those infected. The problem is, however, the models developed by and used by the Imperial Report were by no means perfect. Accordingly, it was less than certain that the numbers produced by the report and the prescriptions given were required. Still, in light of the scientific and moral uncertainties and out of an abundance of caution, politicians decided to limit social gatherings and impose social isolation and distancing for much of the spring and early summer. The choices made and the reasons given all have the hallmarks of precautionary reasoning. Now, the precautionary principle has been formulated in a number of different ways, but we'll focus on the Wingspread Conference statement. It says, when activities raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some of the cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Now, the precautionary principle has, among others, two main components. First is the uncertainty component. That is, given our lack of understanding of the causal mechanisms, it is uncertain what will happen if we do or do not intervene. Second is the precautionary condition. That is, steps that aim to prevent or minimize the bad potential effects are justified under such conditions. Philosophers have taken these statements and attempted to precify the principle. As Miriam Thallos puts it, precaution has its reasons. What these reasons are vary by philosopher. Stephen Gardner defends the precautionary principle on maximin grounds. Precaution is justified when we are uncertain, so that we get the best out of a potentially bad outcomes and avoid the truly catastrophic and disastrous outcomes. Others, like Jonathan Wolfe and Eric Pearson, argue that the precautionary principle is not a principle at all, but something like an attitude. When values that we cannot replace are at stake, like human life, and we do not fully understand the risks and benefits of potential interventions, then proceeding with an extra precaution is morally justified. Given the uncertainty surrounding COVID, medical professionals and politicians then were simply utilizing the precautionary principle when they imposed preventative measures like lockdowns throughout the country this spring. More importantly, utilizing precautionary principle, lockdowns, and social isolation seem to be morally appropriate steps to take given our lack of scientific certainty about what direction the pandemic would go. There are still reasons, as philosophers have noted, to worry about precautionary reasoning. One such issue with the precautionary principle is that taking precautionary steps might lead to disastrous results itself. Avoiding nuclear reactors out of an abundance of caution led us to rely on fossil fuels, which has created dangerous climate change. Accordingly, precautionary actions themselves might be subject to the precautionary principle and further precautionary action. All of this looks to render precaution either incoherent or useless. The problem is, lockdowns and social isolation have the potential to themselves be disastrous. We've sort of seen this in what Kristi was just sort of talking in our need for social engagement and social interaction. We're social creatures. We need to interact with people. Isolating then leads us to be depressed, and that has problems itself. Further, social isolation is slowing the economy. This leads to deaths of economic desperation through increased suicide rates and drug overdoses. Social isolation locks vulnerable women and children into abusive households with no way of getting support, increasing the rate of spousal and child abuse. Children with learning and behavioral needs are unable to get one-on-one help that they need to be successful. All of this combines for a potentially disastrous outcome. Accordingly, acting out of an abundance of caution for COVID might itself require precaution making such steps incoherent and forcing us to rethink how we want to attempt to mitigate the risk of pandemics. Rather than engaging in precautionary action, we might ask what other steps we can take to reduce the risk of reduce the risk of the pandemic. And so even if the precautionary principle itself isn't applicable, we might need other types of risk reducing measures. One thing, and here's the sort of pivot onto the next topic, one thing that would be useful in the fight against COVID is a vaccine or some sort of treatment. This might render the need for preventative or precautionary measures moot. Although it will not reduce the need for masks and social distancing, at least not initially, it might mean that we don't have to engage in such extreme lockdown measures, especially as the numbers of cases, as Jonathan sort of mentioned, are seeming to increase and looks like they're going to increase vastly over the next few months, especially as winter forces us indoors. Given the cost of COVID, both from the disease itself and from lockdown and quarantine measures, medical institutions have been racing for a vaccine. Just this week, Nature announced that test subjects in the UK would be intentionally infected with COVID in an attempt to test a vaccine in human challenge trials. Human challenge trials are where people are intentionally given the vaccine and then exposed to the disease without the standard dosing and safety tests being first run in an attempt to see how effective the vaccine is. Such a rush in human challenge trials are inherently risky. Rushing out a vaccine could lead to one that is either ineffective or has severe side effects. The steps skipped in a human challenge trials are those steps that are specifically in place to test whether there are potentially adverse effects, and if so, what? Skipping straight to human challenge trials means that test subjects are being exposed to a vaccine where it is unclear how effective it is and whether it has any side effects. This is rather risky in itself. However, coronaviruses, of which COVID is one strand, carry an added risk: the potential for vaccine enhancement. Vaccine enhancements occur when a vaccine makes the disease worse once exposed rather than protecting the patient. In such a case, vaccines administered in human challenge trials might not only be ineffective, they might make COVID worse, an already life-threatening disease worse, once the patient is exposed to it. Human challenge trials are quicker than standard drug trials. Skipping steps could speed up the process, potentially saving lives. It also increases the risk. The World Medical Association guidelines for medical testing said that when the risks outweigh the benefits, medical professionals must assess whether to continue, modify, or stop the trial. This is the issue that's precisely at question here. As Julian Savulescu, a bioethicist, I believe at Oxford, puts it, whether such risks outweigh the benefits depends on what risks we are willing to take. It is a matter of weighing the added risk to test subjects being administered an unproven drug, which may itself make the disease worse, against the added threat that a prolonged pandemic poses to the general public. This puts us between a rock and a hard place. We do not want to use test subjects as a mere means towards the greater good. Doing so is where medical abuses have happened in the past. Yet we also want to avoid doing untold damage to the number of human lives that are threatened by this disease. In just these situations, many philosophers of risk push for a democratic discussion of which risk we are willing to run and which we want to prioritize. Do we want to prioritize avoiding the risk to patients who are intentionally exposed to a disease as test subjects? Or do we want to prioritize avoiding risk to the general public, including those who are being hit particularly hard by this disease, like the elderly and people of color? The problem then is that we are having the wrong conversations about COVID. Rather than discussing whether we should be wearing masks or whether this is all fake news, we need to have a candid discussion about what risk we are willing to take in pursuit of a cure and a treatment. Without such discussions, medical professionals will lack the guidance required to pursue medical testing in a morally appropriate way. And here, has to be a democratic discussion. And so this is a conversation that we should be having in our classes, in the news, in other sort of places. Rather than debating masks, we need to be talking about how far and how fast we're willing to go to slow down COVID in pursuit of a vaccine and a treatment.
Thank you. I'm so proud to be colleagues with people like this. All great presentations. We have time for a couple of questions. We can take them from the internet, the YouTube chat, or from in person.
To the professor that talked about communication, what do you suggest is the best way for us to continue socializing while also staying safe?
That's a really good question. And it's one that I've grappled with myself, is how do we socialize? How do you make friends? How do you interact with people and still be able to, follow all the guidelines that you need to? I had an experience recently. I found some of the things that I discussed in my speech about this defensiveness and suspicion, I also experienced this summer. And I had a recent experience where I was able to attend a play similar to how you are here, where I was very socially distanced. And I ended up sitting next to a woman that, in my opinion, met the requirements of a person who probably shouldn't be out in public at all. She was very old. She clearly had some health issues. She had a difficult time walking into the room at all. And we ended up sitting near each other. And I was a little grumpy about the fact that she was there, because I thought, you're putting your life at risk, and therefore that's forcing all of us to make this, go on longer and longer. But as the play continued on, so I was a little bit cranky about the situation, kind of like the Homer Simpson suspicion slide that I showed you. That was me. I was sus Homer. But as the play began, it was a play about rock and roll from the 1950s. And she started to get really excited with the songs. And she would lean over to me and she would say, "This is a song I loved in high school." And as the hour progressed, she got so excited and she was dancing at all these songs that what I failed to realize until that moment was that underneath that mask wasn't a COVID case, wasn't an old woman, wasn't a high-risk individual, but a human being who really wasn't that different from me. There was an age difference, but other than that, she was still a person. So for myself, what I'm trying to do to be able to maintain my sanity and humanity is remember that even though I have to socially distance, I refuse to not acknowledge other people as humans. So when you go out in public, I recommend, if we start making eye contact with each other in the masks and we start saying, "Hi, how are you?" and acknowledging other people, I think that what you'll find is that people are so hungry for that connection that you'll feed them a little and you'll feed yourself as well. Does that make sense? And when you do get to connect, when you do get to associate with people, I hope you have the opportunity to actually ask them real questions instead of the, "Hey, how's it going?" Hopefully they say fine. Say, "Hey, how's it going?" I mean, really. And really talk to them, and you'll be able to have some connection. Does that answer your question?
Time for one more question.
So this is kind of about risk, but I think it would apply to any of the people on the panel. So we have this situation where we have this pandemic with this virus that there's a lot, it's very dangerous, there's a lot of unknowns, and so there's a lot of risk. And at the same time, we're in this situation where we have this kind of hyper news broadcast, so many sources of news, so many varied sources of news, and so much sensationalized content. How do we get to where we can have the kind of conversations you were talking about that are more important than just debating whether or not to wear a mask?
Yeah, yeah, I have my microphone. I mean, that's a really good question, because one of the sort of it's a question about the sort of reliability of the information, and then whether or not we want to update on it, and how we should sort of update our beliefs and then manage the situation in terms of all of that. And that has a lot of moving parts, and so it's a really sort of complicated question. I mean, again, I think it sort of comes down to trying to find quality information, as Jonathan was sort of pointing to. We need to be looking towards, you know, CDC, World Health Guidelines, you know, reliable information and updating on that. And so this is cases where going to, whether it's on the right or the left, these sort of polar places who are trying to sensationalize is bad. And so I think there's two ways to do it. One is we do need to slow down a little bit. And we have to give medical researchers time to come up with what quality information they can. But it also means that we have to realize that we can't take the normal year, 2 years, 5 years to do these extended studies, because by the time they're done, we have hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of people who have passed away because of this disease. And so we have to sort of take a second to allow them to do research. We also have to realize that what the prescriptions are and what the science says and what our best practices are going to change as new information comes in and as we get better information. And so what might have been best practices early on might not be the same thing after a few months or after a year. And we have to allow that that's how science works. And so we have to be willing to say, okay, the evidence said one thing at the beginning, and now it is saying something else because we have new information or broader information or better information, and to be willing to update accordingly. And so I think it takes sort of two things. One is sort of a step back from our 24-hour news cycle to let the scientists do their job, but also then sort of being willing to update or change as we get new and better information.
Let's give them one more round of applause.